Well, good evening, everybody. As I, Nick Pennsylvania, here as I always am with my good friend Brendan Bond. Good evening, Brendan, and how are you?
I'm doing well, Nick. How are you doing tonight, buddy?
I'm doing especially good because we have last week we had the triumphant return of our friend Brian. It
Mm-hmm.
had been, I think we realized it had been just over a year since we had spoken to him last. And tonight we are graced by the company of one of my super best friends, Mr. Chris D. And Chris and I have known each other since first or second grade, I want to say.
First.
First grade.
Yep.
Mrs. Flick back in the day. Yeah, long time. Longer than I care to admit. And Chris periodically chimes in, and we have read some of his comments. I think my favorite recent comment you've made was with regards to the Finger Lakes, the Seneca drums episode, and
Ah,
what strange fish lets wreck it with gay abandon.
Yeah.
Um, but Chris also has one of my favorite true stories,
Mm-hmm.
I have made him tell it to strangers on the city bus before, and I've asked him to say it one more time in the hopes, in the vague promise that I will never ask him to repeat the story again. But it seriously is one of my favorite stories. It's not a long story, but it is unsettling, and especially if you know the lay of the land where it occurred, as I did, not clearly as intimately as Chris does. But and I also have a question that I was originally going to pose to you, Brendan, and to Brian last week, but just the conversation went in different places than I anticipated. I know Chris enjoyed the episode. Not to put the words in your mouth, I personally was afraid I'd gone off into a weird place, but I think everybody that has commented and stayed with us through the course of that one. But before I get to my question, and before we get to Chris's story, there were those weird psychological, or not psychological, the weird Zener
Mm-hmm.
cards. And you
Oh,
had an
yeah.
update for us on that,
Yeah,
Brendan.
I just had a funny story because that was for those of you that didn't listen to the episode. We when we were talking about remote viewing, we mentioned ESP because it's like a similar train of inquiry. And I'd come across these Zener cards, which are basically used to test ESP in laboratory settings. Historically, going back almost 100 years. So I've just been like playing with them a lot and running them by a bunch of my different friends. We did it in the episode, and then a few nights later, I was having another just like Zoom chat with a number of my friends, and I was like, okay, let's do some Zader cards, Uh,
And there was much rejoicing.
yeah, and everyone was super pumped about it. And in two of the people that we were chatting with do have some abilities. The one lady who had never used Zener cards before and was equally as skeptical, or I guess like not unsure about how well she would do. Literally, the first card, I was like, I lifted it up and I was like, okay, what is it? And she went, oh, I don't know, a red cross. And that's what it was.
Of course.
So, like, first guess right off the bat. And it was but the thing I thought was so interesting about it, after we got done laughing and I got done cursing at her for freaking me out, the thing that we kind of realized is like, if you're trying to do it, it's probably a lot harder than if you just like, oh, let's just see what the first thing is that comes to me. Because you had mentioned, Nick, like almost like trying to card count with it.
Yes.
But she didn't even know what all the options were. That's the crazy thing.
Yeah,
She
because you
just,
didn't
you know,
spoil it ahead
didn't
of
spoil
time.
it, right? Yeah. So she just
I'll
picked that
also
out of
say
thin
that
air.
on her
So
first card, she tied my score because the
right.
scoring we were going with
Yeah,
was
no, she would have been, yeah.
she would have tied me at three.
hmm
And
So,
I
but
beat
I just thought that
Brian.
was interesting. That freaked me out pretty good because it's like I don't know. It was nuts, especially with someone who is active in developing their abilities like that. I just thought that was interesting. I wanted to let everyone know that someone did get one right off the bat once at least. So
But here's the thing. If you believe in this, and clearly I don't, how do we know that the superpower is ESP and not just the ability to see through thin layers of paper?
that's maybe that's it too. That's the thing. Well, and that's the fun thing about a lot of this paranormal stuff. Whenever we try and use like really crazy yet mundane explanations for things, it's like, well, that's still pretty incredible. Like we talk about, like, oh, what if the UFO was just plasma? It's like, well, that's worth talking about too. You know, like, is how often do you see a ball of plasma just hanging out above a tree line? So I think that there's things to talk about either way, even if that is the case. And you're right, it might not. Some of these things probably aren't what they think, what we think they are, but that doesn't mean they're not interesting.
All right. Chris, your opinion on the original Ghostbusters movie?
Yeah, it's been a very long time since I've seen that.
Oh, especially this time of year, it's a classic. Might have to bust that out soon.
And I think that was the first and only place that I'd been well, let me correct myself. This whole Xander card thing, I think that
Hmm.
was most people's first introduction to that concept. And for whatever as large brained as we pretend to be, I like that the only reference we kept going with is the original Ghostbusters movie.
Right, right.
So here's a question I have for the both of you. Okay, on the subject of ghosts, because we are
Mm.
now into October, and that's a favorite topic of everybody. Growing up, I know there were great shows like In Search of, we speak about that quite a bit, and Unsolved Mysteries. And I know the three of us had watched those shows, and there would be ghost episodes. We've talked about all this before. And of course, when we were in college, that was when the big ghost show boom happened. We've
Hmm.
spoken about this quite a bit. All right, growing up, what were some things, and I'm going to throw this to Chris first, just
Hmm.
because I feel like bring Chris in here. What were some of the explanations people have for ghosts? What were ghosts trying to do? What were some of the rules that you remember? Because I've seen a shift.
I mean, it was, I know there, I can't think of anything off the top of my head. Like there were rules about going through walls, about why they were here, if it was somebody who was wronged for whatever ends.
And that's where okay,
Hmm.
focus on that. Why were they here? Why were they still here?
Hmm
What were some of the things you heard growing
I
up?
mean, it could be anything from just the vague unfinished business that I think was a trope in many a movie for
Ding,
a very
ding,
long
ding.
time.
That is exactly what I was hoping one of you would say. Now, so thank you. And I'm sure, Brendan, would you deny that
Hmm.
you heard that a lot? Now,
Oh yeah,
something
yeah.
I feel has shifted, and I've got a hypothesis as to why. I feel like there were a few camps, and sometimes there would be debate as to which was which. There was always kind of the residual thing. And we've heard about
Hmm.
that a lot. And I think that's one of the ones that sticks around more than what we call now an intelligent. But then there used to be this thing where they not only were did they die dramatically, tragically, but they didn't know they were dead.
Hmm.
And they had to, in order for them to stop being ghosts, they had to confront that reality. Or, as Chris said, they had to correct something. They had to,
Hmm.
something was left undone that needed resolved. I feel just anecdotally speaking, and I turn to the both of you for this, I feel that that whole idea of there's something left undone that needs resolved, I feel like that's gone away.
Hmm.
I don't know
Yeah,
how the two of you would feel.
I'd say that narrative doesn't really exist anymore. Yeah, I feel like I don't know what's replaced it, but I feel like I don't hear that one.
Yeah, Brendan, I'm curious for you to weigh in because I do have a hypothesis, and we could talk about that in a minute. But what are your thoughts, Brendan?
So, yeah, I really think that like the dramatic death was a big part of it. But I feel like the unfinished business stuff happened more and more, especially tied to like untimely deaths. The one I remember a lot too was like people who were like jilted lovers. I feel like I used to hear a lot of that. I'm not really sure what has kind of replaced that element of it. What's your kind of like?
Well,
hypothesis.
I don't think anything's necessarily replaced it. I think the jilted lover thing, any ghost story that has been established
Hmm.
continues. You know, like I can't remember where, but there's so many hotels where some either the bride or the groom on the
Hmm.
wedding night commit suicide in the hotel, and now they haunt the
Hmm.
hotel. Common story. I think
Right.
that back in the day that would fall into something needing to be resolved. My
I think
hypothesis is this. Oh, go on. Go on.
I think nowadays you have it's not gate the access to an audience isn't gate kept anymore. So you have people all over the place that are exploring whatever insert abandoned asylum,
Hmm.
factory, hospital, whatever. And there's plenty of those across the world and country. So I think it's more of a focus on the place and the kinds of things that happened there. I mean, when we were young, there was a abandoned asylum, which is south of here, that I know a
Hmm.
lot of people that we knew would go there, and that was their thing. And that was before everybody had a 7 megapixel camera in their pocket. So
Absolutely.
I feel it's more location based now and more narrative around what went on here rather than just like a
Well,
jilted lover, like a Romeo and Juliet kind of
right.
story.
Well, I think you're getting at something there, Chris, is there's kind of two things that happen with like the unfinished, unresolved thing. That usually happens, or I think that used to happen a lot and still does happen, like you mentioned, Nick, when we know someone died in a place tragically, or think someone, we talk about that with like crybaby bridges and stuff like that. There is a existing story somewhere, therefore any phenomena gets retroactively attributed to that story. It's like, oh, something tragic happened here with this person. Now we hear banging on the walls. It must be their unrestful spirit. So that's where you have the phenomena you're experiencing, and you have an existing story. Whereas places like some of these asylums and places that are just inherently very tragic, a lot of times you have a activity happening and you say, okay, well, this must be an unrestful spirit. Let's do spirit box sessions. Let's do divining. Let's do other things to figure out like who it is. So I think a lot of times before you started with the story, now you're starting with the location in a lot of places. So I think those are kind of the two
Okay. So
where
so
those things
freeze
can
so
come
freeze
from.
there.
Yeah.
Freeze there. So I think it boils down to this. Chris, I do think you have something again with
Hmm.
we're more focused on location than necessarily a specific person, and we try to draw upon specific person by researching the history of the
Hmm.
location, or we create stories based on what we think had happened.
Hmm.
Brendan, you got to a point there which I think just eluded me a little bit. But it's like, yeah, we set up in a location, and again, it's going back to what I was saying. We try to draw stories forth from a location, and I know I've made
Yeah.
fun of that a little bit. Like, are they adhering to property lines? How
Right.
exactly do we demarcate? But here's my hypothesis for a lot of this shift that, as I see it, in folklore and the development and the maintenance of a specific subset of folklore, which of course is the urban ghost story. And that, again, I ask you before I reveal the hypothesis, is what would you say distinguished the ghost hunter, the investigator sort of person in the early 2000s when we were in college from the people that were telling the stories and researching the stories in the 80s and 70s when we were growing up?
Chris, do you want to take that one first? I got lots of thoughts on that.
I'll let you go on that one.
So I think what you have, Nick, the first question is what distinguished, the ghost hunters of the early 2000s versus, people doing research in the 80s.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
the same type of people. What
yeah.
was different about the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s versus the 80s and 70s?
Well, so I would say my facetious answer would be matching black polos. Those
That
were
is important.
the
Plus
matching.
budget.
Yeah, Matt, if you didn't have matching black polos, is it really a ghost hunting
First you
group?
get the polos, then you get the show, then you get
Yeah,
the endorsements.
right, exactly. It's every you can only have one fedora in the whole group. It's there can only be one guy with a vest. It's very much like a ska band.
One buddy's got to
Um,
be ripped.
right, yeah. Um, uh, no, but I think the big difference in the types of researchers isn't so much that like because people in the early 2000s were doing a lot of academic style work. You had a lot of people writing books and whatnot that were kind of collecting things and then a lot of times trying to go out and verify, it seems like. You also had a lot of people that were coming to the paranormal through very different ways. You had people that were experiencers of some way or sort when they were into one other type of research and then thought, okay, maybe I can take the skills I have as an academic or a novelist and apply that to this new thing that's kind of obsessing and taking over my life, if that kind of makes sense.
Okay, I need you to back up there a little bit because you said academic type research versus something else. So who was the academic type research?
Well, so I think the academic, I mean,
Who,
like,
what era?
oh, well, I mean, I would say like 60s and 70s.
Okay.
Yeah, like earlier and stuff. You have the stereotypical tweed, research. Basically, the people that we were cosplaying for our Hemlock Hellbenders photos.
Right.
You have people that started
The
as
parapsychologists.
yes, no, parapsychologist
Yes.
is a much better word for it. Parapsychologist versus, people coming at it from a non structured discipline like that. I guess what I was also referring to there was people in the 80s, like Whitley Strieber, who was a novelist, and then after some alien experiences, wrote Communion, which is one of the most lauded books, whether you believe it or not. I think one of the things that people have a hard time with that book on is it's so well written that it almost seems fake. But then you remember the guy is actually a novelist. So it's like, okay, he knows how to put a story together. Whereas, again, in the 2000s, you're not so much getting that with folks on TV.
Okay, and how would you describe the folks in 2000s beyond the polo?
Beyond the polo, I mean, I think a lot of times too, you look at the more popular shows and everything, you had people that were trying to like push the boundaries, I think, and
How
doing
so?
lots. Well, I mean, you had people doing different types of experimentation, bringing in different pieces of gear, using different methods. That wasn't just the typical stuff based off of old, like spiritualist movement stuff.
Okay,
Yeah.
pause
Hmm.
right there. Chris, any thoughts that have come to your mind through hearing Brendan?
I mean, I guess the people in the 2000s would have been informed by those of the 70s, but outside
Sure.
of that, and maybe with being a more flair for a more television centric audience at the time, I don't know. I don't really have
Yeah.
too many big thoughts on that aside of the people in the 2000s would have just been standing on the shoulders of those that came before them and trying to dive deep. And I think we probably all had the weird Pennsylvania book at one point or another that
Yes.
was informed by that.
Hmm.
Yeah. Okay, so Chris, you actually hit on something that I hadn't been thinking about, and Brendan, you were getting close to what my thought was,
Hmm.
and I'll finally reveal this. But Chris, I think you're absolutely right in saying that there was definitely more of a media savvy, and I think those were some of those shows. I think they were a byproduct not only of all the work that I think of the TAPS people in particular because
Hmm.
I see them as kind of having to of launching the era with that Ghost Hunter show. They were clearly doing that sort of thing for a while,
Hmm.
but I do think they were also informed by the popularity of the shows we had mentioned that I had mentioned earlier today.
Right.
And so therefore they're much more media savvy. And even though cable had expanded so much just from the early 90s, it was still, they came out, I want to say like around 2003. So right before the whole streaming thing.
Mm-hmm.
really atomized our, television viewing thing. Because again, if you wanted to watch that show, yeah, you could TiVo it, you could record it different ways, but the programming was that it came on this day at this hour, as opposed to what we've had now for years and years on television, which is just huge blocks where it's just one show over and over again for a while.
Mm-hmm.
So the media savvy aspect and really gearing it towards visuals, I think, is a big thing. Now, my hypothesis kind of goes towards what Brendan was saying. I see the 60s, 70s, and 80s as really being that kind of the parapsychologist thing. There was a big holdover from the spiritualist movement, as you say,
Mm-hmm.
Brendan. And so I think there was which the spiritualist movement and the parapsychology thing, I both think are very academic in the sense that they are bookish people. And I don't mean that insultingly, but
Mm-hmm.
the spiritualist movement is very much a bookish thing. Whereas the parapsychologists are starting to try to implement a scientific aspect. But
Mm-hmm.
you said that they collect stories and then they go and try to verify, which I think is kind of poisoning the well a little bit.
It
It's
can
kind
be,
of
yeah.
setting it up to lean you
Mm-hmm.
towards one thing or another. I see the people in the early 2000s and now being much more scientifically minded, even though I have long said a lot of these contraptions and devices that they're using, they haven't demonstrated exactly how these have merit in this search.
Mm-hmm.
But, whereas before there would be folk tales and anecdotes and
Mm-hmm.
stories and books collected, and then they would go to a place and they would try to verify after that,
Mm-hmm.
gets to what was said earlier with Chris' statement about now we go to locations and we try to collect evidence there, and then we go to the
So,
books and
yeah.
collecting the folk tales and try to verify
Mm-hmm.
from that. So my thinking is part of the big shift, as I see it, anecdotally speaking, about why we don't hear, oh, ghosts are only around because they don't realize they're dead, and
Mm-hmm.
or there's some unfinished business that needs to be resolved. I think that's because that is a romantic era, spiritualist era sort of
Mm-hmm.
idea and not a scientificism, if that makes sense. I'm curious as to what you both think of that hypothesis of mine.
So that makes sense. And I think from the early 2000s to now, you had, again, a lot more gatekeepers. If it was going to go on cable television, it had to be entertaining. It had to follow what, like the AP's press guide, where it has to be
Mm-hmm.
interesting in this. And there's a lot more demand for results. So I think you got crazy contraptions and you were going to get a result. Otherwise, it wasn't really worth putting on television. Whereas now, I heard somebody out on YouTube say this, where even failure's monetizable,
Mm-hmm.
where that
That's a
definitely
great
wasn't the
point.
case.
Yeah.
So I
Well, and
think
So,
there's
it creates an
maybe,
argument too, because people like me are going to tune in and be like,
mm-hmm.
well, you turned a flashlight, you intentionally turned it so that any sort of vibration is going to put it on or off. Go on.
yeah, and I think there's maybe a return to earnesty in a sense. I mean, even though it's never been easier to fake any whatever you want at this point, but I think
Mm-hmm.
generally speaking, at least in this realm, people are probably more honest than they were in years past.
Interesting. I
Yeah.
think I'm inclined to agree with you on the earnestness. I think there's always going to be charlatans,
Mm-hmm.
but I think, again, the 70s, in my mind, not really being there,
Mm-hmm.
in my mind, the 70s were so dominated by people like the Warrens who, now that the veil is kind of pulled from that, are much more dubious
Right.
than even they were considered by their detractors back then. Brendan, what are your thoughts?
So, lots of thoughts. So, I'm going to toss in a cynical wrench into the use of the scientific stuff real quick. If I'm a producer working on these shows in the early 2000s, in mid 2000s, and up till today, if I'm a producer, I'm saying, hey, we have a format that works. You have a family that is having activity. You come in, you use these devices to basically get tension built up to show that something is in fact going on here to add legitimacy to these people's story. Then what you do is you send people to go research the history of the house, history of the land, all these kinds of things. And you come back and you say, oh, it's because of it must be this person and they have unfinished business because of A, B, or C. And then you either give the family a way to deal with it, or you cross the people over or whatever. And again, all those things aren't necessarily wrong or bad, but I think the implementation in some ways, if I'm a producer, if I don't believe in this stuff and I'm a producer, I'm saying you get as many gadgets as you can because that's better for the narrative. So
now, I do not argue that. I definitely think that
it can be both. Yeah.
television is a cynical place.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to hold this microphone to a speaker until it makes noises.
Yeah. But again, a formula only is adopted en masse.
Right.
Because it's worked before. So it worked before because somebody was willing to try it.
That's true. That's true.
So why were they willing to try it? Well, because these guys up in New England have been doing it for like 10 years and they garnered enough interest to warrant giving it a chance on a show.
Yeah.
And again, I always joke specifically about Animal Planet having that show. Yeah. And at some point they all became that show. And Animal Planet would be like, we had a pet dog and the dog was acting weird. And that's the only 10 seconds to an animal. But by golly, we're going to remind you, we're going to justify her being on Animal Planet. So yeah, I agree with you, but it still came from somewhere. And media informs, it's the give and take of what is real. So media is then going to inform practices. So when we hear and see about people in the region ghost hunting, they too have adopted that procedure. And it's the trappings of scientists.
No, go ahead, Chris. I have another thought.
That might be why I enjoyed that paranormal home inspector show you turned me on to.
Greatest show ever.
It's really good. Yeah.
And people want to believe. So it's so your furnace is dumping carbon monoxide into your house at 17 times the normal limit. That's probably why you're feeling lightheaded and hallucinating. And then he leaves and they're like, yeah, that might be true, but man, this graveyard that existed beyond the train tracks, that really speaks to me here. And it's like, wait a second.
Right.
That home inspector, Brian, that dude is a Canadian folk hero. I've said it before. His song shall be sung again. But you know what? That show, I loved it. It was a low budget affair. I know I turned you both on to it.
Yeah, it's really good.
I don't know how many seasons it went on, but I feel like the mundane explanations is probably a turnoff to a lot of people.
I think it was only 2 seasons, but and again, the low budget too, but I see it as being the most extreme show because you had 3 hosts. One was the spiritualist movement that couldn't walk into a phone booth without thinking that there were demons floating about. And then there was the woman that did the academic research, who was kind of the main host, even though she was on camera the least. And then there was Brian, the hero we need, who was just like, oh, well, you know why you're feeling chilly in this room is because you put a wardrobe over your air. That's why. So your forced air is not coming through. Yeah. And I'm so happy that you brought that show up. That was the most extreme example because there you have the romantic, the academic, and just the materialists. And it was great television for the argument, but also because that Brian, the home inspector guy, really demonstrated there's a lot of weird stuff that you might not realize has very, very mundane things. And our environment can really trip us up. Carbon monoxide poisoning is no joke. And yeah, maybe you're still creeped out by the cemetery across the train tracks, but let's address this.
Both can be true, and
you can be spooked out by that, but probably what's more likely the culprit to what's going on? Let's try to cancel that out first.
Right.
I'm far more concerned with getting suffocated
Right.
or what. Yeah, I'm
The,
far more concerned about dying from carbon monoxide
mhm,
poisoning than I am the local cemetery.
right. Oh, for sure. And I think that and you're getting to something there too, I think, where with the science, and like you mentioned, Nick, there are narratives at play here. And I think another one of the big reasons for the introduction of science is obviously, like we've said, to kind of try and quantify these things because it's kind of the antithesis of that romantic notion of like the story-driven rationale. The reason I get a little cynical with that sometimes, again, is I think that at least in my experience, in the experience of a lot of people I've talked with and everything, and just even folks that I've read, the majority, in my experience, of paranormal experiences are very unsatisfying. They're not
Yes.
they're not romantic in the sense that they fit cleanly into a narrative. They're really weird, and the problem is again, if this is me being cynical, I'm sorry for saying this all night, but like if you're a ghost hunting group and you have a show, not even if you have a show, even if you're just a ghost hunting group, let's just say you're going somewhere to do an investigation. In a lot of cases, people have more to gain from quantitative data coming out of an investigation than there not being anything found. So the more the more chances you have to gather that, the more likely I think people are to have a positive experience or think more highly of the group or the methods. It kind of feeds itself in that sense.
And it all has resulted in the precipitous drop off of ghosts floating around trying to check off a to-do list before they can go
Yes.
to Davenport or wherever they go,
Yeah.
wherever are we when we cross the mortal
Hmm.
coil. I do think,
God, if I'm
and
going to
I'm
Rhode
gonna
Island, I'm going to be pissed.
that'd be all right.
I mean,
Well, I'm gonna
sorry.
wrap a bow around this real quick, but I will say that one of the stories of the romantic type that still lingers
Hmm.
with regard to location is that where somebody has died definitely still lingers, and that goes to Chris's statement too about I'm much more worried about dying from carbon monoxide poisoning than I am about the cemetery across the railroad tracks because I'd wager one of the locations where the fewest people have ever died is a cemetery.
It's in a cemetery. Yeah.
Right. Not a lot of accidents happen there because there's not a lot of people there that often.
Yeah.
You know, I don't even see videos like parkour kids going crazy in the cemetery. So, probably the least haunted place ever if death and your
Yeah.
location is to do with that. But, okay, this is, again, one of my favorite is a weird thing to say about it just because it is a spooky story. The circumstances around it are decidedly not happy, but I just think it's a perfect example of like this is a little thing that happened that because of the setting and everything else, it's just very unsettling. Chris, one fun final time for me and for all the Danes that have never you have honestly of all the people I know who have shared stories, you have one of the more unique things. It's one of the stories that I've never forgotten, and I remember you telling it to me a day or two after it occurred because I was actually at the garage with you.
Mm,
We were pulling a windshield from a car, and you showed me the car. It was still
okay.
there at that time.
I don't remember that detail. But so
I
yeah, it
remember it
was.
because it was for a family friends. We were pulling a windshield out. But anyway,
Oh,
irrelevant.
yes. So it was 2004, the fall of 2004, probably about this time of year, which is for anyone in the future would be October, November-ish, where the days are getting shorter. I had wrecked my car weeks earlier and I needed parts to put it together. And I had recently quit my job at a computer shop and went to work at an auto shop slash junkyard as one does.
Right. The totally lateral move.
Yeah, totally lateral, normal move that people do. So I was working on my car at said shop, and it was there's also a junkyard attached to it. But of course, this junkyard didn't have what I needed, and we had to run like 2 hours up to Erie to go get the parts for it. So my friend Brandon had a truck. I did not. We jumped in the truck in probably mid-afternoon, drove up to Erie, picked up the car parts. We're coming back home. It's getting dark early. So by the time we got back to the garage to drop off all the parts, it's, I don't know what time, but it's dark out at that point. And then we had one other guy with us, my other friend Ron, and he had mentioned that he was looking for a part for his car. I'm like, oh, we got one of those like right inside the gate. So we unloaded my parts into the shop. Then we walked down into the junkyard at night. There's no lights whatsoever. There are no lights anywhere. Like there's maybe one on the building.
I was gonna say
So
this is kind of in the woods. It was a pretty hilly place in my
yeah,
memory too.
yeah, you had to come up a pretty steep hill to get up to the shop and junkyard. So we're up there. We walk down into the junkyard. We're looking at it. My friend Brandon gets real quiet and he's like, what is this? And we look up from this car that Ron's looking at, and there's a car across the junkyard with its headlights on, which struck me as highly irregular.
Yeah, because oftentimes one of the first things you do when you drop a
Just
car,
pull a battery.
exactly, because there's no reason for it to be sitting there plugged in and everything. Yeah.
So we looked at each other. We're like, obviously none of us did it because it was midway down the line of cars. It definitely wasn't on when we got there because we had to walk down into it slightly. So we had a clear view of everything from when we came in. At that point, we're just like, yeah, it's time to go. And we just walked back to the truck and just got out of there as quick as possible and then promptly hit a deer on the way out. So,
I forgot about the deer.
yeah, didn't do much
Wow.
damage to his truck. I think it cracked the grill, but that was just kind of the icing on top.
But then you went back.
Yeah, I went back on the next weekday when I was working there. I found the car. It was like a 80s or 90s Ford Escort that the battery had not been pulled on. The car was thoroughly thrashed and it had no reason to have done such a thing. The headlight switch was off. But yeah, I pulled the battery right after that one. So I can only
Yeah.
assume that there's some bizarre, I know Fords of that era had plenty of headlight switch issues, so it's probably the simplest explanation for it.
Well, it was also like a weird wiring era because I remembered late 80s Ford Escorts, and boy, this is starting to sound like car talk. You had to get your a gas tank to pop, and there was another button too. I forget what it did. You had to open your glove box, and there were two push button
Mm,
poppers. One was yellow and one was like an ochre red sort of color. And I think the yellow one you would push and your gas door would pop open. The other button, I forget oh, it was the trunk. It popped the
okay.
trunk.
Yeah,
But
that was the era of
they
cars
weren't
where
just pulleys.
yeah, that was the era of cars where they ran the entire load of the headlights through the headlight switch, which often resulted in headlight switches melting or otherwise malfunctioning. So I don't know. To this day, I still don't exactly know what happened, but at least that seems like the most plausible explanation. It was
Yeah.
still very
And it,
absolutely weirded me out at the time.
well, clearly there were three of you there and you were all very much of the opinion that you should be done and you should
Yeah,
leave.
there was like we need to leave now. Like there's nothing else spoken and we left.
Yeah.
So, and three people that know a thing or two about cars
Mhm.
too. I think it would had to have been something rather unusual for all three of you to go through your like mental checklist of like, oh, like what are the odds are that that these headlights just turned on halfway through us being here, and everyone immediately goes, not very likely.
Well, and I
Yeah.
remember wondering,
enough you go
like,
the whole way to paranormal, you know.
yeah, and on the paranormal realm of things, I remember asking you, like, was this car in any way in like a fatal accident? And I think you weren't able to be certain, but I think you said no at that time. I
I
don't
couldn't
know.
say. I mean, it definitely wasn't any it wasn't anything fatal. Anything that would have befell it would have been mundane, used up car of the time.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, my first thought was, who's out there?
Well,
Who's messing with me? Are we alone?
right.
Hmm.
Well, and like and again, like we've said
And
many times, that's oftentimes more scary than if it's
yeah,
paranormal.
21 years later, I still couldn't answer that question.
And again, let's say it is a person. Let's say it is mundane. Say it's a person. What a weird place for someone to be just hanging out and then wanting to screw with you. Because, like, let's say it was someone else who worked there. They would have been jawing at you the next day you were in, asking
Yeah,
you about it kind of thing,
Well, and
or
again, why would
whatever.
that be the way to do it?
Right.
yeah, I would have heard about it. And
Right.
Right.
if I found myself in such a position where I'm in a junkyard in the middle of the night and other people turn up there, I think it'd be kind of my duty to screw with them. But
Yeah.
to be fair, I mean, I would do it. But
But
I don't
would
think there
that
was
be your
anyone else
path?
out.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's almost too subtle. I'm just going to hook
Right.
this battery up real quick, turn the headlights on. Judging by the vague memory that I have, which is, as we've learned, is probably inaccurate, it wouldn't have been the car that I would have gone to turn the headlights on, because I wouldn't
Yeah.
have had much confidence that they would have come on. So it's like, if you were going to mess with somebody, that probably wouldn't be the way that you would do it. I would go with the
No.
four ways, because then the blinking, the flashing would,
Hmm.
I think, be
Seriously.
more of an attractor. But even then, it remains one of the spookiest stories that I always remember that. And
Well,
yeah,
and like I said, like I think it's cool, Chris, that you did try and like do some work on trying to figure out what had happened. But again, this kind of goes to what I said earlier about like most paranormal encounters are relatively mundane. This doesn't fit nicely into a story about like you said, Nick, a fatal car accident or something. Like that's what our
Hmm.
brains want to do. We want to be like, what is the impetus of this? How does this fit into part of a narrative in some way, shape, or form? And it is wholly unsatisfying when you don't have that.
and when
Yeah,
you
and I mean,
don't have that, we create it.
Yeah.
I mean that we had vehicles there that had been involved in such tragic things that had to
Hmm.
sit out back basically until whatever court proceedings had finished, just in
Hmm.
case whatever needed to be investigated. But
Right.
I mean, you just kind of stayed away from those, and I don't remember anything abnormal about it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's
And yeah, maybe part of what's so intriguing about this story is that, unlike those vehicles where and you just had to wait it out, you never saw anything abnormal from them, this one, it's, well, why did it do that? And as Brendan, you alluded to, we are story driven by our very nature. So when we don't have answers, we create a story. And I think that, in a way, I think that has a lot to do with just the birth of folklore, because we're still telling this story.
Yeah, all these years later, I still remember it like it happened yesterday.